Cool. So, well, hi everyone. Welcome to my session, The Iceberg, Your Attack Surface Just Got Bigger. So what are we going to talk today? So there are a few things that we're going to talk about. So first of all, we're going to have a look at the cybersecurity challenges. Then we're going to have a look at the iceberg. And you might be like this little emoji saying to yourself, what is she talking about? But I'll explain what the iceberg is. Then I'll explain how you could leverage the tools on the GitHub Marketplace to secure your pipeline. And then I'll give some tips and best practices to harden your open source software projects. So first of all, let's take a step back and let's define what is open source software. So the term open source software was actually coined by Christine Patterson in 1998. And this was just an endeavor to make it more understandable to newcomers and to businesses. And we know that open source software is source code that anyone can inspect, modify, and enhance. And also we know that many people love using open source software for several reasons, because we do love OSS, the ecosystem. But one thing to consider, even if it's more secure than proprietary software, it does come with its own set of security challenges. And we're going to have a look at a couple of open source software attacks just to understand a little bit more what is going on. So the first one is typo squatting attack. So this one is when bad actors push malicious packages to registry with the hope of tricking user into installing them. This is the same as website phishing attacks that will exploit typos made by individuals who may accidentally typing a wrong address. So here we have an example with the React package. You can see in that case, it will not install React. This will install instead a malicious package that has a completely different end goal. Another attack is malicious packages. This is to inject malicious code into a software product in order to compromise dependent systems further down the chain. So here we have an example with Fall Guys. You might be familiar with this game, but usually the malicious actor will try to surf on trends. In that case, a game that has been quite popular during the pandemic. So users might think that by downloading this package, they will get an advantage in the game. Unfortunately, this is a malicious package, and it will attempt to read local sensitive files and exfiltrate information through a discarded webhook. So that was the entry point. So this is known as supply chain attack, and unfortunately, it affects all ecosystems, not only the NPM ecosystem. It's also called third-party attack, and this occurs when someone infiltrates your system through an outside partner or provider with access to your systems and data. So actually, supply chain attacks are quite attractive to hackers because when commonly used software or packages are compromised, the attackers could potentially gain access to all of the enterprises that use the software. So here we have an example of a classic workflow from coding to the consumer. And you can see there's actually a lot of entry points and potentially attacks on here. So at the coding phase, there's the typo squatting that I've mentioned. There's also another one called dependency confusion. So there's kind of typical attacks from that entry points. But also we can see that the build, the storage, and consumers, there's a few events that you might have probably heard of. For example, CodeCov. So CodeCov happened in 2021. CodeCov is a software company that provides a code coverage. And what happened is actually they had their bash uploader script tampered with. So the attacker was able to upload their scripts. And this allowed them to steal credentials, access sensitive data, carry out further attacks. So it's always the same pattern, I'd say, because this tamper with supply chain attack, it makes it a simple entry, and actually the impact is quite big. For example, SolarWinds, in terms of organizations, actually it targeted 18,000 organizations that were using the SolarWinds, and more specifically the Orion platform. This is the one that have been tampered with. So let's try to understand how this is possible, and let's say hi to the iceberg. Let's all say hi. I want to see like wavy hands and emojis on the chats. If you're still confused by that statement, let me explain it to you. So the iceberg is usually used for as a good analogy or metaphor to understand the different layers of our code base. So if we start with our code, where we potentially can have security vulnerabilities, that's our proprietary code, the code that we write within the organization. So that's the first layer. And that's actually one layer that could also produce security vulnerabilities. The second one below is the open source code. Because if we think about how many lines of code we write ourselves versus the number of packages we import to cut down the time we spend coding, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. And that's totally understandable, because we know that the feature already exists in the ecosystem as a package that we're using. But unfortunately, it's bringing new vulnerabilities and expanding the attack surface because of the complexity as well. Let's go down one more layer, the containers. We know that the application needs to be deployed somewhere. We can use containers, static websites to deploy our projects. We can use different ways to do so. Docker, Vercel, Netlify, all the cloud providers. If we're using Docker, we're adding a Docker file now in the equation, which has metadata about your projects. And again, it's adding additional layer and increasing the attack surface and the complexity of your project. And the last layer is infrastructure as code. So infrastructure as code is used to make your code as your single source of truth, where you specify explicitly through code all the infrastructure specifications that you have in your config file. You can have version control, you can test, you can monitor. IC is amazing, but again, it might also bring security vulnerabilities. So now we have a better understanding of the different layers that we have within our applications. So fun fact, the application codes only represent 10 to 20% of our code base. And the rest, open source libraries, containers, and ISC, actually represents 80 to 90% of our code base. And all of these layers can bring potentially security vulnerabilities at different layers. And since it's important to have guardrails at each stages of your pipeline to spot vulnerabilities as your attack surface is getting bigger. And you can start from the coding stage up to the production. And depending on your workflow, you can actually add those guardrails at each stages. So depending on if you're on coding, you can add a plugin within your IDE to flag those vulnerabilities. In your repo, you can actually raise automated pull requests on GitHub. There's a few ways to do so. And talking about GitHub, I would like to talk a little bit more about the GitHub Marketplace. So who here knows about the GitHub Marketplace? A little bit of emojis, just me to check. Cool. Those few. Great. So for those of you who don't know, the GitHub Marketplace was first introduced in 2016 at the GitHub Universe. And it's a place where developers can find integrations and implement them into their workflow, which is great. And you can see it covers actually all of the stages. CI/CD, code review, security, compliance, dependency management. It's amazing. So first of all, let's take another step back. And what do we need to consider before adding those applications and actions? So at first, when you're a team of maintainers, contributors on the open source ecosystem, you need to look at if you want to implement an application or an action within your projects. You can have a look at the different information on the page, and we'll go through this in a second. Also, if GitHub has verified this action or this application. And also what is important for your project is to know what is the programming languages that you're using. Also, what is your workflow and how many tools do you want to implement at each of these steps? So if you're having some sort of DevOps pipeline, you can have one tool for code review, for code quality, for dependencies, and you can have also tools for security to cover those. But most importantly, experiment and get the right tools for your projects. Also, the thing with these tools for open source projects and for public repos, they're all free usually, which is good. So that's why experiment. So let's see and create this baseline pipeline for if you're a contributor or maintainer of an open source project. You can actually leverage security tools from GitHub, the GitHub Marketplace, to create a basic pipeline and implement those guardrails. So we're going to have a look at the basic pipeline, which will include three things. So software composition analysis, and I will define each of these terms, so don't be scared of those. We'll see a tool to prevent secret sprawling, and we'll see a tool to cover static code analysis. So first of all, the software composition analysis. So definition that focuses on identifying the open source in a code base so teams can manage their exposure to security and license compliance issues. And you can see there's a few vendors that actually are in that space to cover that needs. And usually when you go on the GitHub Marketplace, you can actually navigate through the page to have a little bit more info. But the most important is actually on the left side, you can see the supported languages. And just to make sure that it actually covers the ecosystem and the languages that you're using within your projects. So here you can see with Renovate, they usually have the same kind of pattern. They'll those tools will usually raise pull requests to let you know which version you can update to. They'll also give you information if there's any breaking changes. So at the end of the day, it's yourself who actually will make the decision to merge that change or not, depending on the workflow and the test suite that you might have within your open source project. Another tool is Snyk. Again, have a look at the supported languages and make sure that it's actually covering the languages and packages that you're using within your code base. And again, the tool will raise a pull request to let you know a little bit more, to give you that context. Also, you can get actually email and digest, so you can have like weekly, daily, monthly, so depending on the settings, just to let you know if there's any new vulnerabilities within your the packages and libraries that you're using within your code base. So that was for the software composition analysis. So we have this covered. Let's move on to secret sprawling. Actually, that's a great one. We have a definition from GitGuardian. So what is secret sprawling? So secret sprawl is the unwanted distribution of secrets like API keys, credentials through multiple systems. So, and actually, this is a good thing if you attended my Kinsey presentation before, because he actually did a great demo live. But we'll have a look at GitGuardian. You might be also using different other tools, open source tools, but this is great. So again, you can have a look at the page just to make sure that this tool will fit your needs and your code base. And then when you install it, I would recommend for GitGuardian also specifically if you're having a lot of different repos, to make sure that you actually scan all of these repos, because we're talking about credentials, API keys, so really sensitive info. We don't want to have them compromised, so it's good to have that visibility. So make sure to actually scan all of your repos to have that historical data. So once you've done that, so for this presentation, I've been using the OSS shop. For this one, it's actually vulnerable, and you can see there's a few keys that have been flagged. So this is giving you that visibility, which is great. And then you can act on those, because remediation is actually what we want from these tools as well. Also, a good thing to keep in mind is usually these tools have a lot of integrations. So depending where you're actually hosting your code, should it be GitHub or GitLab, the different steps that you have within your CI/CD pipeline. So also if you're using Circle CI, Jenkins, and others. Most importantly for GitGuardian, what you want is to actually flag those creds as soon as possible. So within your CLI, so I would strongly recommend to use a pre-commit, pre-push, to actually make sure that you capture those secrets before being pushed to your repo. So we've seen secret sprawl. Let's see the last one, static code analysis. First of all, definition, what is it? So it's a method of debugging by examining source code before a program is run. It's done by analyzing a set of code against a set of coding rules. Few examples, you might know Sonya Cloud. So you can use it through the website. You can use it also through the GitHub Actions if you actually have those set up within your workflow and your projects. So once you've uploaded your project, this will give you, again, the historical scan, to let you know if there's any security vulnerabilities. Also, this tool will give you if there's any code smell, duplication, but we're more interested in the security bits. And this is usually what you have from these tools. It's flagging you the snippet of code which is vulnerable. It's giving you a snippet of code to actually fix and remediate. And there's also a little bit of education piece for some tools, just to give you a little bit more context on that security vulnerability. And if you're a fan of metrics and insights, they usually have a heat map on those. So you can see all of those metrics if your code is actually completely covered, or if there's any gaps. Another good tool is CodeQL from GitHub. This one is natively implemented through GitHub Actions. And if you don't know where to start, you can actually install it through GitHub Actions. So if you're on the repo, you click on GitHub Actions, you can set up this workflow by clicking this little button, and it will actually populate your YAML file, which is great. The only thing that you need to check if it's actually capturing the correct programming language. So in my case, again, I'm using the OSS shop demo, and it's using both JavaScript and Python. I know it's quite small, but actually at the bottom, it's the language is covering JavaScript, Python. I'm good with this. I'm committing that one, and it will actually trigger the workflow and let me know, give me that visibility. And apparently, there's a lot of vulnerabilities, which is expected from this vulnerable project. Cool. So I've given you a few steps from the pipeline. So you might be asking, this is great, Sonya, you're actually adding a lot of tools in the pipeline, but how do we have visibility? That's actually a really good question. So how does it work on GitHub? So actually, when a contributor, maintainer, will raise a pull request, it'll trigger all the application and actions that you have implemented within your pipeline. So if you scroll down your PR, you will actually start seeing all of these little widgets popping up and letting you know about the status of your delta, the code that you've pushed. And if you go to the bottom of your PR, you actually see all of the checks. So that's an ideal state because everything is green. Usually you will see one or two reds, but this is actually giving you that visibility and making sure that your code is free from vulnerability before pushing to production. Also, one thing to implement, I would recommend for open source maintainers and contributors is to get value from chat ops. So for those of you who are not familiar with chat ops, so chat ops is a collaboration model that connects people, tools, and processes and automation into a transparent workflow. So for example, if you're using a free Snyk account where you can have the team of contributors and maintainers discussing, you'll have dedicated channels for specific tools that will give you that visibility and what is going on in your project. So having said, monitoring and setting alerts is a vital piece, and we know this, where developers can help when they get the right type of information. So if you're asking yourself what it does look like, it looks like this. So with a free Snyk account, you won't have the categories, but you can still actually create dedicated channels for them, just to circle back on the feedback. So from your CI/CD pipeline, from security tools, from all the webhooks that you can actually set up. And this is one example with GitHub. You can see actually when you push the pull request, it'll actually send the webhook to your Snyk channels and let you know in real time. You can see the different colors, and you'll see if there's any issues that can actually fix. Any documentation on GitHub? Yes, you don't need to actually use, if you don't have the budgets, ticketing systems, you can actually use the GitHub platform with their boards. And you can also mimic if you're used to Jira and those sorts of platforms. So when working on an OSS project, you can leverage the GitHub projects to list all of the tasks that you have to work on for a specific feature. So you can create labels, so you can see on the left side, and epics, it's actually called milestone on GitHub, just to track projects or for raising issues. And you can create a security label, for example, to track vulnerabilities into your project. So for example, we have the homepage epic or milestone. So you can see there's like different tasks within it. The only thing that you need to do is to be disciplined. When you raise a PR, you can see on the right side, you need to apply the labels, you need to apply the projects, and you need to link it to the milestones for the project, just to make sure that it actually feeds back to that progression bar that you have at the top. You can see 61% complete, just to make sure that everything is linked properly. And also the cool thing is you can use automated projects or boards because the cards would actually move accordingly to the status of the pull request. So if you merged the card, it would actually, merge the PR, the card would automatically move onto the board, which is amazing. You don't need actually to touch anything. You'll see cards flying over on the board. Cool, so we've seen a basic pipeline. And now I wanted to give you a few open source software best practices. Because adding security guardrails at each stages of your pipeline is great, but you can also harden your open source project by applying the following best practices. The first one is apply the least privilege principle. So this is to set the base permissions to no permissions on the member privilege section, so they can only clone and pull the public repo. And to give additional access, the maintainer will need to add them to teams or make them collaborators on individual repository. So create teams, add users to this team, and allocate them to specific repos with specific permissions. And then you have that granularity actually, and you have that least privilege principle, and you avoid cases where you get compromised GitHub maintainers, where there's an interesting case actually with the event stream example where one of the malicious actor went through all of the issues, was looking if he could actually push potentially a feature. He actually built up the trust with the maintainer. He was pushing some cosmetic changes, so CSS changes, README changes. And then when he got more permissions, well, be trusted a little bit more, he actually managed to push his payload, and he was targeting a Bitcoin wallet's in that case. So make sure to have that granularity and apply the least privilege principle when you're working on open source projects. Make 2FA mandatory for all maintainers and contributors. If you don't do so, actually by the end of 2023, GitHub will require all users who contribute code to enable one or more forms of two-factor authentication. So this will be by default. They will actually set it up. Protect your main branch. So just to make sure to protect your main branch to avoid any accidental deletion by a maintainer, by a contributor, by a malicious actor. So that's one thing. The other thing is if you click on the little edit button, you'll actually have a few options. And one of them is to have all of these little tools that you've actually spent time adding to your workflow to make them required. And you can see on the right side, the little required label. So when you actually raise the PR, those required tools have to be green, actually, before merging the pull request. So this will depend on the threshold that you've set. So you need to sit down with your team and have those discussions if you want to, if you actually have the maturity level in the team and you want to apply those thresholds to your, and have a specific production level. Enable notification alerts. This is to make sure that you're being alerted if there's anything that goes wrong, and make sure to update the email address to make sure that you're receiving notification for your projects. So also one settings that you might also forget about. One thing is to review also the webhooks. So if you're on those that security hygiene exercise, because I've mentioned that these tools are free for open source and public repos, so it's important to have that that exercise where you review your webhooks, and if you don't use them, delete them, because you never know if one of them get compromised, that could potentially compromise your projects. And this goes back to the supply chain attacks. So just to make sure that you have that exercise and to review all of the webhooks and applications that you've added to your project. Check and add licenses. Well, in open source software, license protect contributors and users. So make sure that you have the correct license to use. This is a good starting point here. So if you're not sure about the license, so GitHub is giving you a link to more information on the license. And also if you don't want to start from scratch, you can add the license to your project here. So on this screen, you can see MIT license, which is already populated. It's giving you the permissions, limitation, and condition at the top, so you can review it with your team if this is something applicable for your project. The only thing that you need to do, and this is great, is just to add the year and the full name, in that case, for that specific license. You review it, you submit it, and here you go, you have a license on your project. Finally, you can use automated projects. You can showcase your open source project status. So this one is interesting. So because let's assume that you're a maintainer or contributor and you want to showcase actually how your open source project is doing, all of these little tools allow you to have those tags. And usually people forget to add those tags at the top of your project. And this is not to just brag about your project. It's more about attracting new maintainers and new contributors, because you want actually to showcase that your open source project is healthy. It's also covered, and it's using different tools. Should it be in your DevOps pipeline, on the security side? So just to make sure that you have those, it's always a good idea to implement it through your README file. So it's usually Markdown that you can add, and it will linked. So you can find it for those tools on the setting page. Usually they'll have an options to copy paste and add it on your README file. So yeah, I would strongly recommend to have that at the top of your README file, just to give that visibility for other maintainers. So a few key takeaways before I close this talk. So open source can be a vector for large-scale cyber attacks, unfortunately, and we've seen it a couple of years ago with the vulnerability in Apache Log4j, the open source Java package used to support the activity logging in many Java applications. So this was greatly in December 2021. It was like big impact on the industry. It was quite a nightmare. But yeah, the open source software can also be a vector for large scale cyber attacks. So make sure if you're using OSS to leverage the application which are available on GitHub Marketplace and free for open source projects and your public repos. And also, if you don't work for an open source project, but you're working on a pet project, or if you're prepping for an interview, you can actually showcase this tools just to show that you know how to set up a DevOps pipeline and to secure your pipeline, which is good also to showcase. So having visibility through your pipeline using different tools and guardrails is critical to reduce your attack surface. And you've seen it with the iceberg, so it could be quite big. And we've seen that leveraging the application and actions from the GitHub Marketplace could help. And as maintainers and contributors, do not hesitate to create a small pipeline to start. Experiment with the tools. If they don't suit your project, you can still remove them. Make sure to remove and have that cleaning exercise for your webhooks and applications. And don't forget to harden your GitHub projects for everyone that are contributing to it. So experiment, but most importantly, I would say do not push your keys on GitHub, please. So before I close, I've actually wrote a handbook on this topic. I can actually share it on the chat link. Just share it. So I don't know if you can actually scan this. So yeah, this covers more in depth, because I only have 30 minutes on this one. It goes more in depth on the topic, and there's a little bit more tips around OSS security and how to make also an impact as a contributor if you want to upskill on that sense. Yeah, just whoops. And going back here. Here. So yeah, I'm Sonya Moisset. I'm passionate about DevSecOps, open source, and cloud security. I'm a senior security advocate at Snyk. I'm also a writer for FreeCodeCamp, a GitHub star, doing other things that I'm not going to bother you with today. But if you want to link, yeah, you can link up with me on LinkedIn at Sonya Moisset. And yeah, I just wanted to say thank you. And don't forget to stay safe in your journey to open source software contributions. Thank you.